Well, as my late Armenian father used to say, every picnic needs a skunk, and I might as well be the one for this one. I thought I would take a slightly different approach to the subject at hand. I confess I was a little surprised. It wasn't until a couple of days ago I learned that the symposium was not about fake news, but about fake news as it relates to the Armenian Genocide and to Nagorno-Karabakh. So while I've been listening to Robert Fisk and Amberin, I've been thinking, how can I possibly connect these two topics to each other? And I think there are one or two ways I can approach it. One is, let me just put this out as a proposition. Fake news is a phrase that President Trump likes to use, and it has achieved a certain vogue recently, and all sides politically argue about what it means. My own particular crackpot theory is that fake news is actually as old as antiquity. In fact, much of what we consider to be news and history is in some form or another fake news, because what we know about the past, the distant past as well as the very recent past, is based on so many different things. It's based on conjecture, it's based on folklore, it's based on mythology, it's based on eyewitness accounts, which are notoriously unreliable. It's based on oral history, where there are no governing rules about what people say and whether we can test the validity of what we say. And so what we think we know is the truth is in fact very difficult to ascertain. And people like Robert Fisk, of course, go out into the field and literally dig up the bones to get the evidence, but that doesn't happen very often, especially with scholars and historians and journalists, or people like me who sit in their study pondering these things, surrounded by books, who don't go out to the field to dig up the bones to find the evidence. And so the Armenian Genocide is one of those topics that's particularly vulnerable to fake news. There's fake news about it in itself, and of course for the past 95 years, the successive Turkish governments have pursued a kind of program of promoting fake news about the genocide. But let me just put, and I'll give you just a homely example. We all have our Armenian stories. My own that I like to illustrate about the fallibility of evidence is that I'm only half Armenian. It was my father who was the Armenian, and his parents emigrated to Philadelphia in 1907. And they came by way of Marseille to Philadelphia. And my grandfather, in fact, one of the minor treasures of my study is that I have a photograph that was taken of my grandfather, my grandmother, and my grandfather's mother, my great-grandmother, in Marseille. And my grandfather is wearing these high peasant boots, and he's wearing a fez, and my grandmother is wearing this wonderful sort of national costume. God knows what happened to it. I've often assumed my grandfather tossed his fez into the Mediterranean at the first opportunity he got, but my grandmother is standing between them. And when they got to New York, when they got to Ellis Island, and I have found the story was in the family that, as you know, people who came to Ellis Island were examined medically, and it was found that my great-grandmother had conjunctivitis, an infection of the eye, which is today easily curable with antibiotics, but not so then, and of course quite contagious. So she was not admitted to the United States and sent back to the Ottoman Empire and never heard from again. There were varying stories about what exactly happened to her. The presumption is that she was with some cousins of the family who did make it to Aleppo. She did not. Now, when I found some years ago the manifest of the ship that they took to New York, her name was not on the list. And that I then had to embark on a minor investigative journey to find out. In fact, it wasn't in New York, it was in Marseille, where she was determined by the American consulate to have conjunctivitis, and it was from France rather than from New York that she was sent back to her death. Now, it's a distinction without a difference, but it's an example, I think, of how, at least in my family, a long-standing, sad family anecdote actually was based on details that, upon closer scrutiny, didn't turn out to be quite right. And I will say that in a lifetime of thinking, reading, hearing, attending lectures, visiting Armenia, I'm always struck by the sort of lamentation of the Armenians. Obviously, the genocide occurred. Our people were massacred in huge numbers. The Turks are riding high. They deny the genocide. No one seems to care, as Adolf Hitler may, or speaking of fake news, may or may not have said, who now remembers the Armenians? It all seems too terribly true. But I have a slightly contrarian view of all this, that things actually are a little more, I'm a little more optimistic about the general subject than most Armenian Americans are. And for a number of reasons, if we put it a little bit into historic perspective. As I said, our knowledge of history is based on evidence, quote unquote, diaries, anecdotes, tradition, folklore, mythology. In the end, we can't always be really certain whether Edward II died in Berkeley Castle or not, or whether Henry VIII actually signed this or that, or whether President Polk said to so-and-so. In the end, we kind of have to take on faith what we're told happened, but can't always be absolutely certain about it. The Armenian Genocide is interesting to me because it really, of course, began long before 1915. It began with the Ottoman depredations toward the Armenians, toward the neighboring Greeks and Bulgarians. And at the time, given the state of the world, it attracted the attention and the allegiance, at least from the Armenian standpoint, of most of the leading statesmen of Europe. Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, was a great advocate for the Armenians and a deep critic of the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. Lord Bryce, of course, was a friend of the Armenians. Cardinal Newman spoke out about all of this. The establishment of, at least of England, in effect, if not France and even Wilhelmine Germany, were all very mindful of what was happening to the non-Turkish populations in the Ottoman Empire. And this was, I think, to some degree, a reflection of the extent to which the genocide was a religious matter as well as a clash of nationalities. I mean, you had Muslim Turks misbehaving with Christian Armenians and Greeks and Bulgarians. But it really was a front and center in the conscience of the world at that time. My father died 45 years ago, but among his papers, he grew up in Philadelphia, and there were a number of papers about the campaign that took place in Philadelphia in the early 1920s on behalf of the starving Armenians, which of course was a familiar phrase of an earlier generation, less remembered now. But if you look at the handbills and the brochures that I found in this file, all the major names of American, what we would now call the American establishment, were there being counted for the Armenians. William Howard Taft, Elihu Root, who was probably the preeminent elder statesman of the time, Henry Cabot Lodge. They were all advocates for the Armenians. Not to mention President Wilson at the Versailles Conference, one of the many nationalities that he expressed sympathetic interest in were the Armenians. But as often happens in history, time goes on, other things happen. What shocks us today is a little less shocking next week, and a year from now, we have trouble remembering what it was that shocked us a year ago. And this is the same process as occurred with the Armenian Genocide. As you well know, after the end of First World War, after a couple of years, Armenia, such as it was, such as what was left of it, was subsumed into the Soviet Union. And for the next, well, what was it, 40, 50 years, Armenia, such as it was part of the Soviet Empire. And I think Armenian national identity, while the Russians didn't suppress it, simply went out of the consciousness of the world at the time. The starving Armenians were no longer starving. They were no longer remembered. The Armenians who had managed to get out of Armenia or the Ottoman Empire had gone to Australia, or to America, or to Canada, or to Britain, or wherever. And then, of course, in the 1930s, a far greater tyranny emerged on the world stage, and in the Second World War we had a genocide that was even larger, numerically speaking, than the Armenian Genocide. So by then the Armenian Genocide, or the Armenian massacres, or whatever people chose to call it at the time, since the word genocide wasn't invented until much later, was then subsumed by Cold War politics. Turkey, by the grace of geography, happened to be on the periphery of the Soviet Empire, and so it became a part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, even though, in my opinion, it really, as with Turkish membership in the European Union, it was a somewhat contrived association. But this was the origin of the reason why successive American presidents up to the present day have always said, I will say something about the Armenian Genocide when they're running for office, but then when they're in office, the weight of the State Department or the Foreign Office or whatever comes in, and the commercial connections we have to Turkey are weighed in the balance and found to weigh a little bit more than recognition for the genocide. And as a consequence, the Armenians are eternally frustrated and angry and sad because it appears that the Turkish narrative of this event seems to have prevailed. My argument is that the opposite has occurred. That in fact, what's interesting about the Armenian Genocide to me, and I don't mean to minimize the problem of finding the evidence, of dealing with the Turkish government and so on, but what's interesting about the Armenian Genocide is when you put it in the perspective of the 20th century, it's interesting and in some ways encouraging that the memory of it has endured to the extent that it has. Now, part of that reason, I think, is because there's such an enormous Armenian diaspora in the world. I confess the one and only time I've been to Armenia, which was almost 20 years ago now, one of the things that struck me traveling around was the number of people from the diaspora, whether from the United States or Argentina or Britain, Australia, Singapore, what have you, who were there working with NGOs, who had volunteered their time and sometimes their money, their expertise, to help Armenia get on its feet. Now, I have an equally cranky view of the future of Armenia. Poor Armenia, this landlocked country that's been invaded right and left over the centuries, was under the heel of the Ottoman Turks for 500 years and then under the heel of the Soviet Union for another 75 years. Things are not going to be very rosy in Armenia, in my opinion, for a long, long time. There's much to overcome. However, here were all these American Armenians and so on working to build modern Armenia, which is something you do not see in Kazakhstan or other parts of the old Soviet Empire. There really is a remarkable Armenian diaspora, which still to this day, even though we're now removed by a couple of generations, still takes an active and useful interest in the fate of that, in the fate of the the tiny Republic of Armenia. So in spite of the fact that we have this, up until very recently, we had this sacrosanct strategic relationship with Turkey. We have an Air Force base in Turkey. The Pentagon is full of generals whose best friends are the former commander of the airborne brigade of the Turkish this, that, and the other. All of these professional associations at various echelons of the American government all weigh in very heavily when recognition of the genocide comes up. But on the other hand, the genocide resolution always, almost invariably, gets to the point in the House of Representatives, for example, where it's very clear it's going to pass, and it's only very strong pressure from the White House and the State Department, the Defense Department, that causes them to hesitate. Similarly, all across Western Europe, in the liberal democracies of Western Europe, the Armenian genocide is not a matter of controversy, it's a matter of fact. It's even a matter of official fact. As a journalist and sometime historian, I have reservations about national legislatures making judgments about historical events. I don't really think that's their function. But nevertheless, I do feel a certain pleasure when the Belgian legislature or the French or what have you pass a resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide, and the Turkish ambassador in Paris is instantly recalled from Paris back to Ankara and so on. And I admit I get a sort of chuckle out of that, but it also emphasizes to me that although the tragedy of the genocide is palpable, and the political problems we face in trying to get official recognition out of the State Department are difficult. And you mentioned I worked in the State Department for a year. I concluded at the end of that year that it should be the Stasis Department, not the State Department, because it's a monument to the status quo. And Turkey, when I was there, Turkey was our dear strategic ally. It was a crossroads country that was poised right at the exact point between East and West. It was absolutely essential to American foreign policy. And I always just say, well, people used to say that about Iran, and of course we've managed reasonably well without Iran being our close ally. So you never know what the future holds. But in spite of all these obstacles and diplomatic pressures and whatnot, the genocide, in a curious way, lives. One of the interesting things to me, I grew up in a city, I grew up in Washington, where when I was a boy, there was really a microscopic Armenian population. There really weren't any there. And it wasn't until I became a journalist that I started writing things, and I started getting letters and so on from people who purely were responding to my surname, which had never happened to me before. It had happy consequences sometime. I had to, in the early 1970s when I worked at the New Republic, I had to write to William Saroyan on a copyright matter, and purely my surname attracted his attention, so we embarked on this long correspondence and later met and so on. And the same thing is true with the genocide. I would say once a month, maybe a little less often, I get a letter from someone with an Armenian surname in Columbus, Ohio, who's outraged by the fact that there's a professor at Ohio State or something who denies the Armenian genocide, and he's in the pay of the Turks, and is there anything you can do? And my argument to them is, no, there isn't really much I can do except continuing saying what I say. But you know, when you think about it, the number of American academics who deny the Armenian genocide is severely limited. I mean, I think we know who they all are. 2 or 3 of them are literally in the pay of the Turkish government. They're not taken seriously in academic circles. I certainly accept what Robert Fisk said about how journalists misconstrue and misinterpret and cover up, but that's that's a failing of journalists who have a historic memory going back to about 2009 or so. So I expect a little bit more of scholars, and there really is no scholarly consensus against the Armenian genocide outside, I assume, of Turkey. Even in countries in the region that have strategic connections to Turkey, such as Israel, for example, very few Israeli historians deny the Armenian genocide. So despite the fact that fake news, in my opinion, is not only pervasive, but to some degree the way of the world, and despite the fact that there are all sorts of official obstacles to the public appreciation and understanding of the Armenian genocide, what strikes me is not so much that it's a losing battle or that it's a struggle that we are discouraged about, but quite the opposite, that the Armenian genocide in the midst of the blood, at the very beginning of the bloody 20th century, still lives in the public memory, and not just among Armenians, but it is a now almost universally accepted fact about the horrors of the 20th century. Now there are pedants who will debate about whether it's literally a genocide or not. I happen to believe that it is. Those who say it really isn't a genocide, some have suspect reasons for thinking, others perhaps have a legitimate argument about the meaning. My view is that the man who invented the word genocide literally had the Armenians in mind when he did, so that's not a question. But I'm a professional cynic and pessimist about almost everything. But about the Armenian genocide, I have a cautious optimism, because here we are in great numbers. The idea lives in the scholarship. The resolution does better in Congress than, I mean, when you think of the number of Armenians who live in the United States, I mean, the Turks are always complaining about the Armenian lobby in Washington as if it orchestrates everything that happens, which is far from the fact. When you think of the relative modesty of the Armenian community, and once again, the succession of genocides throughout our lifetimes, the fact that the Armenian genocide lives in our memory and is a living scholarly and political issue, I think is cause, if not for celebration, but at least for a little less discouragement and pessimism than we usually feel. So I don't know whether that answers the question about fake news or not, but anyway, there we are. Thank you very much.